Hey everyone, welcome back to another journey into the quietly devastating corners of history. Tonight we're stepping into the paper walls and silk screens of feudal Japan, where honor was currency, death was poetry, and being married to a warrior meant your life was measured not in years, but in the spaces between his departures. So go ahead and hit that like button if you're ready to drift off to tales of duty, sacrifice, and the particular loneliness that comes with loving someone whose job description includes ritual suicide. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. There's something beautifully ironic about people around the world falling asleep to stories of insomnia-inducing anxiety. Maybe turn on that white noise machine, dim those lights, and settle in for tonight's exploration of what it meant to wake up every morning knowing your husband might not come home. And if he did, he might be carrying someone else's head. In the misty mountains of medieval Japan, while European knights were clanking around in metal suits arguing about chivalry, an entirely different code of honor was unfolding. One that was quieter, more refined, and infinitely more concerned with the aesthetics of death. The samurai class had turned warfare into an art form, complete with rules so complex that dying incorrectly was considered more shameful than not dying at all. But tonight, we're not talking about the samurai themselves. We've heard their stories, read their poetry, admired their swords that cost more than most people's houses. No. Tonight, we're focusing on the women who woke up beside them, who packed their lunches, who maintained their households, and who developed an intimate relationship with uncertainty that would make modern anxiety disorders look like a mild case of Sunday blues. These were women who lived in a world where masculine honor was the sun around which everything else orbited. Their husbands' reputations determined their social status, their children's futures, and whether they be sleeping in silk or straw. Yet they were expected to maintain perfect composure, elegant mannerisms, and graceful acceptance of circumstances that would break most people's spirits before breakfast. The samurai wife was a figure of contradictions. She was powerless yet influential, protected yet vulnerable, revered yet expendable. She lived in luxury while constantly preparing for poverty, in safety while always expecting violence, in love while accepting that honor would always come first. It was a life that required the emotional flexibility of a Zen master and the practical skills of a survival expert. Their days began before dawn, not with alarm clocks, but with the internalized rhythm of duty that had been drilled into them since childhood. While their husbands meditated on death and sharpened blades, these women managed the complex machinery of domestic life that kept the warrior class functioning. They were the administrators of an empire built on the philosophy that today might be your last day, so you'd better make it count. The aesthetic of their world was stunning, all sliding doors and carefully arranged flowers, gardens designed to evoke melancholy, and tea rooms that made meditation mandatory. But beneath the beauty was a current of controlled terror, the constant awareness that their carefully constructed lives could be shattered by a single message, an unexpected visitor, or the distant sound of war drums. Every morning brought the same question, unspoken but ever present. Would this be the day everything changed? The day the messenger arrived with news that her husband had died gloriously, or worse, dishonorably. The day their lord fell from favor and the family faced exile. The day she would need to perform her own ritual suicide to preserve the family honor. These women lived their entire lives in the conditional tense. If her husband returned victorious, then prosperity. If he died in battle, then mourning and possible destitution. If he committed seppuku for dishonor, then she might be expected to follow him. Every decision, from what to wear to how to discipline the children, carried the weight of potential consequences that could echo through generations. The irony was exquisite. In a culture that celebrated the warrior's readiness to die, the samurai wife had to be equally prepared for death while simultaneously being responsible for life. She had to maintain the household, raise the children, manage the finances, supervise the servants, and somehow find time to perfect her calligraphy, arrange flowers, and compose poetry that appropriately reflected the melancholy beauty of existence. Their training began in childhood, not with swords, but with something arguably more challenging, the art of emotional control. Little girls from samurai families learn to hide fear, anger, disappointment, and even joy behind faces as serene as still water. They practiced walking, sitting, speaking, and even breathing in ways that projected calm competence regardless of the chaos around them. By adolescence, they were fluent in the language of silence, masters of communication through glance and gesture, experts at reading the political undercurrents that could determine their family's fate. They learned to pack a traveling bag in minutes, to hide valuables, to distinguish between distant sounds that meant celebration and those that meant evacuation. Marriage was rarely about love, though love sometimes grew in the spaces between duty and honor. These unions were political alliances, economic arrangements, strategic partnerships designed to strengthen clans and consolidate power. The bride might meet her husband on their wedding day, then spend the next decade slowly learning the man behind the armor while he disappeared periodically to attend to the business of war. The wedding ceremony itself was an exercise in irony, surrounded by symbols of prosperity and permanence. Two people would pledge their lives to each other while knowing that those lives hung by threads thinner than the silk of the bride's kimono. The sake they shared might be the last thing they tasted together, the vows they exchanged, already shadowed by the possibility of imminent separation. Their homes were architectural metaphors for their lives, beautiful, fragile, and designed to be easily dismantled. Paper walls that provided privacy but no protection, gardens that required constant tending but could be destroyed by a single storm, rooms that could be reconfigured in moments to accommodate guests, refugees, or the furniture of the dead. The aesthetic philosophy of mono no aware, the pathos of things, permeated every aspect of their existence. This concept celebrated the bittersweet awareness of the impermanence of all things, finding beauty in transience, meaning in melancholy. For the samurai wife, this wasn't philosophy, it was daily reality wrapped in cherry blossoms and morning mist. Even their names reflected their conditional existence. Upon marriage, many took new names that incorporated their husband's family identity, literally erasing part of themselves in service to their new role. Some would change names again if their husband achieved particular honors or suffered particular shames, their identities as fluid as their circumstances. The seasonal rituals that marked their year were tinged with awareness of mortality. Spring cherry blossoms weren't just beautiful, they were reminders that beauty fades quickly. Summer festivals celebrated abundance while acknowledging its temporary nature. Autumn moon viewing contemplated the passage of time and the inevitability of endings. Winter preparations weren't just practical, they were rehearsals for survival. Their relationships with other women in their position were complex networks of support and competition. They shared the same fears, the same hopes, the same impossible balancing act, but they were also rivals for limited resources, status, and their husband's attention. Friendships formed and dissolved based on shifting political alliances, economic fortunes, and the unpredictable movements of men with swords. The children they raised carried the weight of family honor from birth. Sons would become warriors, daughters would become wives to warriors. The samurai mother had to instill courage without recklessness, loyalty without blindness, honor without rigidity. She had to prepare them for a world where death was preferable to dishonor, while somehow helping them find reasons to want to live. Their education was extensive, but narrowly focused. They learned literature, but only certain texts deemed appropriate for women. They studied history, but primarily the stories that reinforced proper behavior and thinking. They mastered arts like flower arrangement and tea ceremony, skills that were both aesthetic pursuits and survival tools, ways to create beauty and meaning in a world that seemed determined to destroy both. The religious and spiritual practices, woven through their days, offered comfort and structure, But even these carried reminders of mortality and impermanence. Buddhist teachings about the illusory nature of earthly attachments took on particular poignancy for women whose earthly attachments might be severed at any moment by violence or duty. Letters from their husbands, when they came, were masterpieces of emotional encryption. Love had to be expressed through classical poetry, worry disguised as seasonal observations, longing hidden in descriptions of distant landscapes. These women became experts at reading between the lines, at hearing the unspoken fears and hopes in carefully crafted prose. The economic reality of their lives was as precarious as everything else. A samurai's income depended on his lord's favor, which could evaporate overnight due to political shifts, military failures, or simple bad luck. The wife had to manage household finances that could range from abundance to near poverty with no warning, all while maintaining the appearance of serene prosperity. Their wardrobes were simultaneously assets and liabilities. The elaborate kimonos that marked their status were worth small fortunes, but could become targets for theft or evidence of inappropriate extravagance if their family's circumstances changed. Every garment had to be chosen with consideration for current political climate, seasonal appropriateness, and potential need for rapid liquidation. Sleep, when it came, was often interrupted by the hypervigilance that comes from chronic uncertainty. The sound of footsteps in the night could mean a messenger with news, an intruder, or simply a servant attending to late-night duties. Dreams were filled with scenarios of loss, separation, and the constant rehearsal of how to respond with dignity to various forms of catastrophe. Food preparation was both nourishment and meditation, each meal potentially the last shared with family members whose fate remained unknown. The aesthetic presentation of simple ingredients became a form of prayer, a way to create beauty and meaning in the face of uncertainty. Even the most humble rice could be transformed into an offering worthy of the gods or the dead. The seasonal changes that marked their calendar weren't just aesthetic transitions, but practical preparations. Each shift in weather brought new considerations. When would the campaign season begin? When would roads become impassable? When would food become scarce? When would survival require different skills and strategies? Their personal belongings were curated with the knowledge that they might need to abandon everything at a moment's notice. Every possession had to justify its existence, not just in terms of beauty or utility, but in terms of portability and necessity. Even their most treasured items were held lightly, appreciated fully, but never assumed to be permanent. The twilight hours, as day faded into night, were often the most challenging. This was when worry crept in despite their best efforts at control, when the carefully maintained facade of serenity required the most effort to sustain. The beauty of sunset could be overwhelming for women who never knew if they would see another one with their families intact. To understand how women came to occupy this precarious position, we need to travel back to the early days of the samurai class, when warrior families were still carving out their place in Japanese society. The rise of the samurai wife as a cultural institution began during the Heian period, roughly the 9th through 12th centuries, when court culture was dominated by refined aesthetic sensibilities and the women who helped define them. During this golden age of Japanese culture, aristocratic women wielded considerable influence through their literary and artistic accomplishments. Lady Murasaki Shikibu wrote The Tale of Genji, considered by many to be the world's first novel. Sei Shonagon penned The Pillow Book, a collection of observations about court life that remains one of the finest examples of Japanese prose. These women set the cultural standard for feminine refinement that would eventually be adopted and adapted by the emerging warrior class. But as the Heian period gave way to the Kamakura era, political power shifted from the imperial court to military leaders. The samurai, originally provincial warriors hired to protect the interests of court nobles, gradually became the dominant force in Japanese politics. With their rise came a new ideal of womanhood that combined the aesthetic refinement of court ladies with the practical strength required to support a warrior lifestyle. The early samurai wives benefited from this cultural transition. They inherited the educational traditions and artistic training of court women, while gaining the respect that came from being partners to the new ruling class. Their homes became centers of culture and learning, places where poetry and politics intersected, where aesthetic beauty served political purposes, and where women's influence operated through carefully cultivated networks of relationship and reciprocity. These pioneering samurai wives were often remarkable women in their own right. They managed vast estates while their husbands were away at war, negotiating contracts, resolving disputes, and making decisions that affected hundreds of people. Some became legendary for their intelligence and political acumen, wielding soft power that complemented their husband's military authority and occasionally surpassed it in effectiveness. The Buddhist concept of the wise woman merged with Confucian ideals of feminine virtue to create a role that was both empowering and constraining. The samurai wife was expected to be intelligent but not intellectual, influential but not ambitious, strong but not aggressive. She walked a tightrope between capability and propriety, demonstrating competence while never appearing to compete with male authority. Their rise in status was reflected in the increasing complexity of marriage negotiations within the samurai class. What had once been simple arrangements between warrior families evolved into elaborate diplomatic processes, involving gift exchanges, ceremonial visits, and carefully orchestrated displays of cultural refinement. The bride's artistic accomplishments, family connections, and demonstrated virtue became as important as her family's military strength or economic resources. The architectural evolution of samurai residences during this period reveals the growing importance of women's roles. Early warrior compounds were purely functional, designed for defense and military efficiency. But as the class gained stability and wealth, their homes began to incorporate elements designed for feminine pursuits: tea rooms for entertaining, gardens for contemplation, specialized spaces for textile work and artistic creation. The rise of the tea ceremony as a central cultural practice exemplified how women's influence shaped samurai culture. What began as a simple Buddhist ritual evolved into an elaborate art form that embodied the aesthetic and philosophical values of the warrior class. Women were often the primary practitioners and teachers of tea ceremony, using this role to maintain cultural traditions and exercise subtle but significant social influence. Literature from this period reveals the growing sophistication of samurai wives' education and cultural participation. They weren't just consumers of culture, but active creators, writing poetry that was collected and circulated, maintaining literary salons that influenced political discourse, and serving as cultural ambassadors between different regions and social classes. The economic foundation of their elevated status was the increasing wealth of the samurai class during Japan's medieval period. As warriors became landowners and administrators rather than just soldiers, their families gained access to resources that allowed for luxury, leisure, and cultural refinement. The samurai wife's lifestyle became a visible symbol of her family's success and social position. Their influence extended beyond their own households to the broader community. Samurai wives often served as patrons of religious institutions, sponsors of artistic projects, and mediators in local disputes. Their opinions carried weight not just because of their husbands' positions, but because of their own demonstrated wisdom and cultural knowledge. The development of distinctive feminine arts during this period reflected both the opportunities and constraints of their position. Skills like flower arrangement, calligraphy, and textile design allowed women to express creativity and gain recognition while remaining within accepted boundaries of feminine behavior. These arts became markers of social status and cultural sophistication. The rise of the samurai wife was also connected to changes in religious practice and spiritual life. As Buddhism evolved to accommodate the warrior class, women found new roles as spiritual advisors, meditation teachers, and keepers of religious traditions. Some established their own temples or retreat centers, creating spaces where feminine spirituality could flourish within the broader masculine culture of the samurai class. Marriage customs during this period reflected the increasing importance of women's roles. The traditional practice of the husband joining the wife's household gradually gave way to patrilocal marriage, but the transition period saw experimentation with various arrangements that acknowledged women's value and agency. Some marriages included provisions for women to maintain separate property or return to their natal families under certain circumstances. The political upheavals that characterized medieval Japan actually enhanced the importance of samurai wives in some ways. When military campaigns kept men away from home for months or years, women had to assume full responsibility for estate management, child rearing, and political networking. These experiences proved their competence and made their contributions indispensable to family success. The artistic achievements of samurai wives during this golden period were substantial and lasting. They developed new forms of poetry that reflected their unique position between court refinement and warrior pragmatism. Their textile designs influenced fashion across social classes. Their architectural preferences shaped the development of domestic spaces throughout Japan. The rise of women's literacy during this period was both cause and effect of their elevated status. As more samurai wives learned to read and write, they gained access to classical literature, religious texts, and political documents that informed their understanding of their world. Their own writing, in turn, contributed to the cultural discourse and helped shape the intellectual climate of their era. The development of sophisticated communication networks among samurai wives created an informal but powerful system of information exchange. Through letters, visits, and cultural gatherings, these women maintained connections that spanned geographic and political boundaries. Their networks often proved more durable than the military alliances that connected their husbands. Their role in child rearing during this period was both traditional and innovative. While maintaining responsibility for early childhood education, samurai wives also began to influence their sons' warrior training and their daughters' preparation for marriage into other samurai families. They became the primary transmitters of cultural values and social expectations within the warrior class. The aesthetic philosophy that emerged from samurai wives' cultural leadership during this period would influence Japanese arts for centuries. Their emphasis on subtle beauty, emotional restraint, and the integration of practical and artistic concerns became defining characteristics of Japanese cultural expression. They didn't just follow aesthetic trends, they created them. The religious and philosophical syncretism that characterized this era was partly driven by women's spiritual interests. Samurai wives often served as bridges between different religious traditions, incorporating elements of Shinto nature worship, Buddhist meditation, and Confucian ethics into coherent personal philosophies that influenced their families and communities. Their economic influence during this golden period extended beyond household management to broader commercial activities. Some samurai wives became involved in trade, craft production, and money lending. Their business acumen often complemented their husbands' military skills, creating family partnerships that were both economically and politically powerful. The rise of the samurai wife as a cultural ideal influenced women's roles across Japanese society. Merchant families aspired to emulate samurai domestic arrangements. Peasant women adapted samurai aesthetic preferences to their own circumstances. The samurai wife became a model of feminine excellence that transcended class boundaries. The legal status of samurai wives during this period was complex but generally favorable compared to women in other societies. While they operated within patriarchal constraints, they enjoyed certain protections and privileges that reflected their value to the warrior class. Some could own property, initiate divorce proceedings, and exercise authority over household affairs with minimal male supervision. The international awareness that some samurai wives developed during this period was remarkable for its time. Through Buddhist pilgrimage routes, trade connections, and diplomatic contacts, they gained knowledge of other cultures and societies. This cosmopolitan perspective influenced their approach to domestic governance and cultural innovation. The artistic collaborations between samurai wives and their husbands during this golden period produced some of Japan's most celebrated cultural achievements. Poetry competitions, garden design projects, and architectural innovations often reflected the combined aesthetic sensibilities of warrior couples working together as cultural partners. The seasonal festivals and ceremonial observances that samurai wives organized became important social and political events. These gatherings served multiple purposes: maintaining cultural traditions, strengthening social bonds, displaying family wealth and status, and facilitating the informal negotiations that often determined political outcomes. Their influence on the development of Japanese cuisine during this period was substantial. Samurai wives refined and codified food preparation techniques, developed new dishes that reflected both aesthetic and nutritional concerns, and established dining customs that balanced practical military needs with cultural sophistication. The literary salons hosted by prominent samurai wives became centers of intellectual and political discourse. These gatherings brought together poets, scholars, religious leaders, and political figures in settings that encouraged creative exchange and cultural innovation. Women's roles as hostesses gave them significant influence over the intellectual climate of their era. The development of distinctive feminine architectural spaces during this period reflected the growing recognition of women's need for personal autonomy within patriarchal family structures. Private gardens, study rooms, and meditation spaces allowed samurai wives to pursue individual interests while fulfilling their family obligations. The rise of the samurai wife as a cultural institution was also connected to changes in military technology and strategy. As warfare became more sophisticated and campaigns more extended, the importance of maintaining stable home bases increased. Women's competence in estate management became essential to military success. Their role in diplomatic activities during this period was often crucial but rarely acknowledged in official records. Samurai wives frequently served as unofficial ambassadors, using their cultural accomplishments and social connections to facilitate negotiations, gather intelligence, and maintain peaceful relationships between potentially hostile groups. The artistic patronage activities of wealthy samurai wives during this golden period supported the development of distinctively Japanese art forms. Their commissions and collections encouraged artists to develop styles that reflected both international influences and indigenous aesthetic preferences. The educational institutions founded or supported by samurai wives during this period made lasting contributions to Japanese intellectual life. Some established schools for women, others supported scholarship programs, and many created libraries and cultural centers that served their communities for generations. The rise of the samurai wife as a cultural ideal was reflected in the literature and art of the period. Paintings, sculptures, and written works celebrated their beauty, intelligence, and virtue. These artistic representations both reflected and reinforced their elevated status within Japanese society. The international recognition that some samurai wives achieved during this period was remarkable for its time. Chinese scholars praised their literary accomplishments. Korean diplomats noted their political acumen, and even European visitors, when they finally arrived, commented on their sophistication and influence. The philosophical contributions of samurai wives during this golden period often went unrecognized by later historians, but were substantial nonetheless. Their synthesis of different intellectual traditions, their practical wisdom about governance and social organization, and their aesthetic innovations influenced Japanese thought in ways that are still being discovered and appreciated. Their role in preserving and transmitting cultural traditions during periods of political upheaval cannot be overstated. When wars destroyed libraries and scattered communities, samurai wives often served as living repositories of cultural knowledge, maintaining traditions through oral transmission and personal example. The rise of the samurai wife as a cultural force reached its peak during the late Heian and early Kamakura periods, when their influence was balanced, recognized, and integrated into the broader social and political structure. This golden age would not last forever, but its achievements would echo through centuries of Japanese history. The legacy of this golden period would become both inspiration and burden for later generations of samurai wives. The cultural heights achieved by their predecessors set standards that were difficult to maintain, and expectations that sometimes proved impossible to fulfill. But the foundation they built would prove remarkably durable, surviving centuries of change, while continuing to shape Japanese concepts of feminine excellence. As political conditions began to change, and the warrior class faced new challenges, the role of the samurai wife would evolve as well. The rise had been glorious, but it contained within it the seeds of the constraints and difficulties that would define the experience of later generations. The golden age was ending, and with it, the unique opportunities that had allowed women to achieve such remarkable influence and recognition. The decline of the samurai wife's golden age began subtly, like morning mist being burned away by the rising sun. By the late 13th century, the cultural and political conditions that had allowed women such remarkable influence started to shift. The Mongol invasions of 1274 and 1281 marked a turning point, not just in military history, but in the social dynamics of the warrior class. The existential threat posed by foreign invasion created a new emphasis on military preparedness and masculine authority that gradually squeezed women out of the influential positions they had previously occupied. The successful defense against the Mongols, while a source of national pride, came at a cost that extended far beyond the immediate military expenses. The prolonged state of military alert required resources and attention that had previously been devoted to cultural pursuits and domestic refinement. The aesthetic sensibilities that had flourished during the peaceful Heian period began to seem like luxuries that a nation under threat could no longer afford. As the Kamakura shogunate gave way to the Ashikaga period, political instability became chronic rather than episodic. The constant warfare that characterized the Muromachi era meant that samurai men were away from home more frequently and for longer periods. While this initially increased women's practical responsibilities, it also began to erode their cultural influence, as the emphasis shifted from refinement to survival. The rise of Zen Buddhism during this period, while bringing new philosophical insights, also carried with it a more austere aesthetic that was less accommodating to the elaborate cultural expressions that had been women's primary avenue to influence. The simple, spare beauty celebrated by Zen masters stood in contrast to the complex, layered sophistication that had characterized the feminine arts of the Heian period. Economic pressures began to mount as constant warfare drained family resources. The elaborate lifestyle that had supported women's cultural activities became increasingly difficult to maintain. Expensive materials for textile arts, elaborate tea ceremonies, and extensive literary collections became luxuries that many samurai families could no longer afford. The practical arts of household management began to overshadow the aesthetic arts that had brought women recognition and respect. The legal changes that gradually restricted women's property rights represented one of the most significant aspects of their declining status. Where once samurai wives could inherit and control substantial assets, new laws increasingly concentrated property ownership in male hands. The economic independence that had supported their cultural activities and political influence slowly eroded. The increasing codification of Confucian gender ideals during this period created new constraints on women's behavior and aspirations. The flexible gender roles that had characterized the earlier period gave way to more rigid expectations that emphasized women's subordination to male authority. The good wife, wise mother ideal became more narrowly defined and more strictly enforced. The military innovations that characterized the later medieval period also contributed to women's declining influence. As warfare became more technical and professional, the informal networks and cultural accomplishments that had given women political relevance became less important than technical military expertise that was exclusively masculine. The architectural changes in samurai residences during this period reflected the shift in women's status. The specialized spaces for feminine pursuits that had characterized earlier mansions were reduced or eliminated in favor of more utilitarian designs focused on defense and military functionality. The physical spaces that had supported women's cultural activities literally disappeared. The educational opportunities available to women began to contract as resources were redirected toward military training for sons. The literary education that had been considered essential for samurai daughters became a luxury that fewer families could afford or prioritize. The intellectual foundations of women's cultural influence were systematically undermined. The religious changes that occurred during this period also affected women's status. While Buddhism continued to offer some opportunities for female spiritual expression, the increasing militarization of religious institutions made them less welcoming to women's participation. The warrior monks who became prominent during this era had little interest in the feminine spiritual traditions that had flourished earlier. The artistic production of samurai wives during this period shows clear signs of the constraints they faced. Their poetry became more conventional, their textile designs more conservative, their cultural innovations less bold. The creative freedom that had characterized their golden age was being replaced by an emphasis on conformity and tradition. The diplomatic activities that had once given samurai wives significant influence became increasingly formal and male-dominated. The informal networks and cultural exchanges that women had facilitated were replaced by official diplomatic protocols that excluded female participation. Their soft power was being systematically dismantled. The marriage customs that had once acknowledged women's agency and value became more restrictive and male-controlled. The elaborate negotiations that had characterized earlier marriage arrangements gave way to simpler transactions focused primarily on military and economic considerations. Women's preferences and accomplishments became less relevant to their marital prospects. The child-rearing practices that had been women's exclusive domain began to be influenced by new military and masculine ideals. The early education of samurai children, particularly sons, was increasingly taken over by male tutors and military instructors. Women's influence over their children's development was reduced and circumscribed. The economic activities that had given some samurai wives independence and influence became more restricted as guild systems and commercial regulations excluded women from many forms of business participation. The entrepreneurial opportunities that had allowed exceptional women to build independent bases of power largely disappeared. The literary production of the period reflects the changing status of women in subtle but significant ways. While women continue to write poetry and prose, their works show increasing conformity to masculine literary standards and decreasing exploration of distinctively feminine themes and perspectives. Their voices were being gradually silenced. The seasonal festivals and ceremonial observances that had been organized by women became more standardized and male-supervised. The creative freedom that had allowed women to shape these important cultural events was replaced by rigid adherence to prescribed forms and masculine oversight of their execution. The international connections that had enriched women's cultural perspective began to be controlled more strictly by male authorities. The cosmopolitan awareness that had characterized the Golden Age was replaced by a more insular focus on domestic concerns and masculine priorities. The technological changes that characterized this period, particularly in military equipment and techniques, created new forms of masculine knowledge that excluded women entirely. The technical expertise that was becoming increasingly important to samurai success was something women could not acquire or contribute to, further marginalizing their role in family affairs. The philosophical developments of the period, while intellectually rich, tended to emphasize masculine virtues and perspectives. The synthesis of different thought traditions that had been facilitated by women's cultural activities was replaced by more systematic and male-dominated intellectual enterprises. The legal system that emerged during this period increasingly treated women as dependents rather than autonomous agents. The legal protections and privileges that had supported their earlier influence were eroded in favor of systems that concentrated authority and responsibility in male hands. The artistic patronage that had been an important source of women's cultural influence became more centralized and male-controlled. The individual and family-based support for arts that women had provided was replaced by institutional patronage that excluded female participation. The religious practices that had offered women spiritual authority and community influence became more regulated and male-supervised. The informal spiritual leadership that women had exercised was replaced by formal religious hierarchies that had no place for female authority. The communication networks that had been maintained by women through letters, visits, and cultural exchanges became less important as official communication systems developed. The informal information sharing that had given women political relevance was superseded by formal intelligence networks controlled by men. The aesthetic standards that women had helped establish began to be modified by masculine preferences and military considerations. The subtle, complex beauty that had characterized the feminine arts was replaced by simpler, more austere forms that reflected masculine values and priorities. The household management responsibilities that had given women authority within domestic spheres became more routine and less creative, as standardized practices replaced the innovative approaches that had characterized the earlier period. Even their traditional areas of expertise were being systematized and controlled. The medical and healing knowledge that had been preserved and transmitted by women began to be superseded by more formal medical systems that excluded female practitioners. The traditional feminine expertise in health and healing was devalued and replaced by masculine medical authority. The seasonal and agricultural knowledge that had been maintained by women as part of their household responsibilities became less relevant as samurai families became more removed from direct agricultural production. Their practical expertise in food production and preservation was no longer valued as highly. The textile and craft production that had been both artistic expression and economic contribution began to be displaced by commercial production systems that excluded women from the most skilled and profitable work. Their economic contributions were minimized and devalued. The musical and performance traditions that had been maintained by women began to be taken over by professional performers, who were often male or operated under male supervision. The informal cultural activities that had given women social influence were being professionalized and masculinized. The gardening and landscape design expertise that had been recognized as distinctively feminine achievements began to be claimed by male designers and treated as technical rather than artistic accomplishments. Even their acknowledged areas of excellence were being appropriated. The culinary innovations that had been developed by women began to be codified and systematized by male authorities, who claimed credit for the knowledge that women had developed through generations of practice and experimentation. The historical record-keeping that had been partially maintained by women through letters, diaries, and family documents became more formal and male-controlled as official historical enterprises developed. Women's perspectives on events were increasingly excluded from the historical record. The cultural preservation activities that had been carried out by women through their teaching, storytelling, and artistic practice became less valued as formal educational institutions took over these functions. Their role as cultural transmitters was being systematically eliminated. The diplomatic intelligence gathering that had been conducted informally by women through their social networks was replaced by formal intelligence systems that excluded female participation. Even their contributions to national security were being made irrelevant. The conflict resolution and mediation skills that had been exercised by women in their communities became less important as formal legal systems developed to handle disputes. Their traditional role as peacemakers and negotiators was being displaced by masculine legal authority. The spiritual counseling and emotional support that had been provided by women to their families and communities became less valued as formal religious and philosophical systems claimed authority over these functions. Their nurturing and healing roles were being devalued and displaced. The artistic innovation that had been fostered by women's cultural activities became less important as standardized artistic forms and techniques were established by male authorities. The creative freedom that had characterized their golden age was being replaced by conformity to masculine standards. The social networking that had been maintained by women across family and regional boundaries became less politically relevant as formal diplomatic and political systems developed. Their soft power was being systematically dismantled and replaced by hard power controlled by men. The economic analysis and planning that had been conducted by women as part of their household management responsibilities became less valued as formal economic systems and professional financial management developed. Even their practical expertise was being appropriated by male professionals. The educational innovation that had been pioneered by women in their child-rearing and cultural activities became less important as formal educational institutions were established under male control. Their pedagogical expertise was being devalued and displaced. The cultural criticism and aesthetic judgment that had been exercised by women through their artistic and social activities became less influential as formal critical and aesthetic systems developed under masculine authority. Their cultural authority was being systematically undermined. The technological adaptation that had been carried out by women in their domestic and craft activities became less relevant as formal technological development was taken over by male specialists. Even their innovative problem-solving was being devalued. The historical preservation that had been maintained by women through their cultural and family activities became less important as formal historical institutions were established. Their role as keepers of memory and tradition was being appropriated by male scholars and officials. The decline was not sudden or dramatic, but rather a gradual erosion of influence, opportunities, and recognition that left samurai wives increasingly constrained within narrow domestic roles. The cultural flowering that had characterized their golden age gave way to a more restrictive and limited existence that would characterize their position for centuries to come. As the constraints tightened around the lives of samurai wives, the physical manifestations of their declining status became grotesquely apparent in ways that would have been unthinkable during their golden age. The bound feet that never quite took hold in Japan were replaced by other forms of physical restriction that were uniquely Japanese in their aesthetic cruelty. The elaborate kimono that had once been symbols of artistic achievement and social status gradually evolved into gorgeous prisons, each layer adding not just beauty, but burden. But before we examine the physical horrors that emerged from this system, we should linger a moment on the exquisite mechanics of how a culture systematically transforms human beings into ornamental objects. The process wasn't accidental or haphazard. It was refined over centuries into a series of rituals so elegant, so aesthetically pleasing, that they disguised their true purpose, even from those who performed them daily. The morning ritual of dressing became perhaps the most perfect metaphor for the entire system. What had once been a simple act of putting on clothing evolved into an elaborate ceremony that could take hours and required multiple assistants. Each layer of silk, each fold of fabric, each strategic placement of ornament served to further separate the woman from her physical body, creating an increasingly elaborate barrier between her authentic self and the world she was allowed to inhabit. The process began before dawn with the application of the white face powder, a ritual that literally erased the natural features that might suggest individual personality or authentic emotion. The lead-based cosmetic didn't just cover the skin. It created a mask that prevented genuine expression, ensuring that only approved emotions could show through the carefully constructed facade. The irony was exquisite. The more beautiful the mask became, the more completely it eliminated the person beneath. The hair arrangement that followed required such precision and artifice that it seemed designed to demonstrate the triumph of culture over nature. Natural hair texture, colour, and growth patterns were completely obscured by elaborate constructions held in place with enough pins and ornaments to stock a small jewellery shop. The resulting architectural marvel was so rigid that it prevented natural head movement, forcing women to move with the carefully controlled gestures of living dolls. The application of the black-tooth dye represented perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the mourning ritual. The act of deliberately destroying the natural beauty of white teeth with a mixture that would slowly cause them to rot required a level of self-denial that bordered on self-hatred. Women had to participate willingly in their own disfigurement, smiling as they applied the poison that would ensure their eventual dental ruin. The binding of the torso with multiple layers of silk and cotton served both practical and symbolic purposes. Practically, it created the flat-chested silhouette that was considered aesthetically pleasing. Symbolically, it represented the systematic suppression of female sexuality and physical autonomy. The tighter the binding, the more refined the woman was considered to be, as if the ability to breathe normally was somehow vulgar and inappropriate. The selection and arrangement of the multiple kimono layers became a complex code that communicated social status, seasonal awareness, and aesthetic sophistication, while simultaneously creating a burden so heavy that normal movement became impossible. The woman who emerged from this process was no longer capable of running, jumping, or performing any of the physical activities that might suggest agency or independence. The obi, the wide sash that cinched the kimono, grew longer and more complex during this period, requiring assistance to put on and making independent movement increasingly difficult. What had once been a practical garment accessory became an instrument of immobilization, requiring a servant to wrap, tie, and arrange the multiple layers of silk and brocade that could weigh up to 30 pounds when fully assembled. The irony was exquisite. The more beautiful the outfit, the more helpless the wearer became. The makeup rituals that evolved during this period of decline transformed women's faces into porcelain masks that literally prevented natural expression. The white face powder, originally made from rice but later incorporating lead compounds, didn't just cover the skin, it poisoned it. Women who faithfully applied this makeup daily for years developed skin conditions that ranged from premature aging to actual lead poisoning, their pursuit of beauty becoming a slow form of suicide. The application of the nail lacquer and the careful arrangement of the impossibly long fingernails completed the transformation from functional human being to decorative object. These talons, beautiful as they were, made it impossible to perform any practical task, ensuring that the woman would require assistance for even the most basic activities of daily living. Independence became literally impossible. The final step in the mourning ritual was the application of perfume and the arrangement of accessories, each chosen to create a subtle but unmistakable olfactory and visual message about the woman's social position and aesthetic refinement. By the time the process was complete, several hours had passed, and the woman who emerged bore little resemblance to the human being who had begun the ritual at dawn. The daily tea ceremony became another vehicle for the systematic elimination of authentic human interaction. What had once been a simple sharing of refreshment evolved into an elaborate performance governed by rules so complex and rigid that spontaneous conversation or genuine emotional expression became impossible. Every gesture was prescribed, every word carefully chosen from an approved vocabulary of seasonal observations and conventional sentiments. The blackened teeth that became fashionable among married samurai women represented perhaps the most grotesque example of aesthetic self-mutilation disguised as refinement. The ohaguro, a mixture of iron filings and vinegar that turned teeth jet black, was supposed to make women more attractive by demonstrating their married status and supposedly making their white face powder more luminous by contrast. In reality, the acidic mixture gradually dissolved tooth enamel and caused gum disease, ensuring that older women suffered constant dental pain hidden behind their serene smiles. The flower arrangement activities that filled the afternoon hours served a similar function, channeling creative impulses into rigidly controlled forms that demonstrated technical skill, while eliminating any possibility of authentic artistic expression. The arrangements themselves were beautiful, but they represented the triumph of convention over creativity, the systematic reduction of human imagination to decorative formula. The eyebrow shaving ritual that accompanied marriage reached levels of absurdity that bordered on self-mutilation. Women would pluck out every natural eyebrow hair and then paint on new eyebrows higher on their forehead, creating an alien appearance that was considered the height of sophistication. The constant plucking often led to permanent scarring and infection, leaving women with foreheads marked by tiny scabs and scars that had to be covered with increasingly thick layers of makeup. The calligraphy practice that occupied many evening hours became an exercise in the elimination of personal handwriting style in favor of approved forms that demonstrated education, while revealing nothing of individual personality. The brushstrokes that had once carried the unique emotional signature of their creators were standardized and homogenized until they became indistinguishable from one another. The hair arrangements required for formal occasions became architectural marvels that caused genuine physical suffering. The elaborate styles, held in place with dozens of pins, combs, and ornaments, could take hours to construct and were so rigid that women couldn't lie down normally for days afterward. They slept sitting up or with their necks supported by special wooden pillows called takamakura, leading to chronic neck pain, headaches, and eventually permanent postural deformities. The music lessons that were considered essential to feminine education focused on the technical mastery of prescribed pieces, rather than the development of musical creativity or emotional expression. Women learned to reproduce approved melodies with mechanical precision, while being discouraged from improvisation or personal interpretation that might suggest independent artistic judgment. The blackened teeth that became fashionable among married samurai women represented perhaps the most grotesque example of aesthetic self-mutilation disguised as refinement. The ohaguro, a mixture of iron filings and vinegar that turned teeth jet black, was supposed to make women more attractive by demonstrating their married status and supposedly making their white face powder more luminous by contrast. In reality, the acidic mixture gradually dissolved tooth enamel and caused gum disease, ensuring that older women suffered constant dental pain hidden behind their serene smiles. The eyebrow shaving ritual that accompanied marriage reached levels of absurdity that bordered on self-mutilation. Women would pluck out every natural eyebrow hair and then paint on new eyebrows higher on their forehead, creating an alien appearance that was considered the height of sophistication. The constant plucking often led to permanent scarring and infection, leaving women with foreheads marked by tiny scabs and scars that had to be covered with increasingly thick layers of makeup. The hair arrangements required for formal occasions became architectural marvels that caused genuine physical suffering. The elaborate styles, held in place with dozens of pins, combs, and ornaments, could take hours to construct and were so rigid that women couldn't lie down normally for days afterward. They slept sitting up or with their necks supported by special wooden pillows called takamakura, leading to chronic neck pain, headaches, and eventually permanent postural deformities. The fingernail maintenance that became standard among upper-class samurai wives involved growing the nails to lengths that made any practical work impossible. These talons, often several inches long and lacquered in elaborate designs, broke easily and painfully, requiring constant attention and care. Women with such nails couldn't dress themselves, couldn't eat without assistance, and couldn't perform any of the household tasks that had once been sources of pride and autonomy. The poetry composition that had once been a vehicle for intellectual and emotional expression became constrained by increasingly rigid rules about appropriate subjects, approved emotions, and acceptable forms of expression. The seasonal observations and conventional sentiments that replaced authentic poetic voice demonstrated education while effectively silencing any individual perspective or genuine feeling. The foot binding that was popular in China never took hold in Japan, but Japanese women developed their own form of ambulatory restriction through the tabi socks and geta sandals that forced them into an unnaturally mincing gait. The split-toed tabi, while practical for wearing with traditional sandals, also restricted natural foot movement and led to bunions, corns, and other deformities when worn constantly from childhood. The dietary restrictions that governed every meal served multiple purposes in the system of diminishment. The foods that were forbidden, anything that might add colour to the complexion, bulk to the figure, or energy to the temperament, effectively weakened women physically while demonstrating their commitment to aesthetic ideals over biological needs. Hunger became a virtue, and the ability to subsist on minimal nutrition was celebrated as evidence of spiritual refinement. The dietary restrictions imposed on samurai wives, in the name of maintaining pale, delicate appearance, led to chronic malnutrition that had devastating health consequences. The ideal of feminine beauty required avoiding foods that might darken the skin or add bulk to the figure, resulting in diets so restricted that many women suffered from anemia, bone weakness, and immune system deficiencies that made them vulnerable to every passing illness. The bathing rituals that were prescribed for maintaining the pale, smooth skin that was considered ideal involved water temperatures and chemical treatments that were actually harmful to skin health. The pursuit of an artificially maintained appearance required the systematic damage of natural skin function, creating a dependence on increasingly elaborate treatments to maintain an appearance that grew progressively more artificial. The sitting posture required of proper samurai wives, knees together, feet tucked under, back straight, when maintained for hours daily as etiquette demanded, led to circulatory problems, joint degeneration, and muscle atrophy. Women who spent decades in formal sisa position often developed permanent damage to their knees and ankles, making walking painful and difficult in their later years. The sleeping arrangements that were required to preserve the elaborate hairstyles prevented natural rest and recovery. Women learned to sleep sitting up or with their heads supported by wooden blocks, ensuring that they never experienced the deep, restorative sleep that might give them the energy needed for resistance or independent action. Chronic fatigue became a permanent condition disguised as feminine delicacy. The smoking of tobacco through long, delicate pipes became fashionable among samurai wives during this period, advertised as aids to maintaining the slim figure that was considered ideal. The reality was that the fine tobacco used in these elegant kaisuru pipes was often adulterated with toxic substances, and the constant smoking led to respiratory problems, tooth loss, and premature aging that had to be hidden under ever thicker layers of cosmetics. The exercise restrictions that were imposed to maintain the ethereal fragility that was considered beautiful resulted in muscle atrophy and bone weakness that made physical resistance to the system literally impossible. Women who had once been capable of significant physical exertion were systematically weakened until they became genuinely dependent on assistance for activities they had once performed easily. The foot binding that was popular in China never took hold in Japan, but Japanese women developed their own form of ambulatory restriction through the tabi socks and geta sandals that forced them into an unnaturally mincing gait. The split-toed tabi, while practical for wearing with traditional sandals, also restricted natural foot movement and led to bunions, corns, and other deformities when worn constantly from childhood. The dietary restrictions imposed on samurai wives, in the name of maintaining pale, delicate appearance, led to chronic malnutrition that had devastating health consequences. The ideal of feminine beauty required avoiding foods that might darken the skin or add bulk to the figure, resulting in diets so restricted that many women suffered from anemia, bone weakness, and immune system deficiencies that made them vulnerable to every passing illness. The sitting posture required of proper samurai wives, knees together, feet tucked under, back straight, when maintained for hours daily as etiquette demanded, led to circulatory problems, joint degeneration, and muscle atrophy. Women who spent decades in formal Seiza position often develop permanent damage to their knees and ankles, making walking painful and difficult in their later years. The smoking of tobacco through long, delicate pipes became fashionable among samurai wives during this period, advertised as aids to maintaining the slim figure that was considered ideal. The reality was that the fine tobacco used in these elegant kaisuru pipes was often adulterated with toxic substances, and the constant smoking led to respiratory problems, tooth loss, and premature aging that had to be hidden under ever thicker layers of cosmetics. The practice of tooth blackening required women to coat their teeth daily with a mixture that not only stained, but also created an environment perfect for bacterial growth. The result was breath so notoriously foul that special incense-burning ceremonies were developed to mask the odor during social gatherings. The romantic ideal of the beautiful samurai wife was literally rotting from the inside out. The corsetry that was adopted from Chinese fashion involved binding the torso so tightly that breathing became labored and digestion was impaired. Women who wore these constraining undergarments daily often developed respiratory problems and digestive disorders, their pursuit of the ideal silhouette slowly crushing their internal organs. The lead-based cosmetics that created the coveted white complexion also caused neurological damage over time. Women who used these products for years often developed tremors, memory problems, and personality changes that were attributed to feminine hysteria rather than poisoning. The beautiful white faces were literally toxic masks that slowly destroyed the minds beneath them. The elaborate nail guards and protective coverings worn to preserve those impractical fingernails often trapped moisture and bacteria, leading to chronic fungal infections and painful ingrown nails. The very accessories designed to protect the symbols of feminine leisure became sources of constant discomfort and medical problems. The heavy silk undergarments worn in multiple layers to create the proper kimono silhouette caused chronic skin problems from poor ventilation and constant chafing. Women developed rashes, fungal infections, and pressure sores from the weight and friction of fabric layers that could total more than 50 pounds when fully dressed for formal occasions. The mercury-based treatments used to achieve the pale skin tone so prized in samurai wives caused mercury poisoning symptoms, including hair loss, kidney damage, and neurological problems. Women literally poisoned themselves in pursuit of an aesthetic ideal, their beautiful pale skin masking the toxic damage accumulating in their bodies. The practice of plucking facial hair, including eyebrows and the natural hairline, to achieve the high forehead considered beautiful, often led to permanent scarring and infections. The constant trauma to facial skin created textural irregularities that required even more makeup to conceal, trapping women in cycles of damage and concealment. The dietary supplements taken to maintain the delicate constitution considered feminine often contained toxic ingredients like mercury and lead compounds marketed as beautifying agents. These medicines caused more health problems than they solved, slowly poisoning women who faithfully followed medical advice designed to make them more attractive. The binding of the torso to create the flat-chested silhouette considered ideal in kimono often interfered with normal breast development in young women and caused circulation problems that led to chronic pain and decreased immunity. The aesthetic ideal literally required suppressing normal female physical development. The practice of sleeping in full makeup to maintain the porcelain appearance at all times led to chronic skin problems, as pores became permanently clogged with lead-based cosmetics. Women developed persistent acne, blackheads, and skin infections that had to be covered with even more toxic makeup, creating a vicious cycle of damage and concealment. The nail lacquers used to decorate those impractical fingernails contained toxic solvents and heavy metals that were absorbed through the nail bed, causing systemic poisoning that manifested as fatigue, headaches, and digestive problems that were often misdiagnosed as feminine weaknesses. The hair oils and pomades used to maintain elaborate hairstyles often contained lead compounds and other toxic ingredients that were absorbed through the scalp, causing hair loss, scalp irritation, and neurological symptoms that were dismissed as hysteria or feminine vapors. The practice of wearing multiple layers of silk and brocade garments in all weather led to heat exhaustion in summer and poor circulation in winter. Women regularly fainted from overheating at formal events, their collapses attributed to feminine delicacy rather than the physical impossibility of thermoregulation, while wearing 30 pounds of non-breathable fabric. The cosmetic tattooing that became popular for lips and eyebrows involved using inks that contained toxic metals and were applied with unsterilized needles, leading to infections, allergic reactions, and permanent disfigurement when the procedures went wrong. The pursuit of permanent beauty often resulted in permanent damage. The digestive problems caused by wearing tight obi sashes led to chronic constipation, acid reflux, and malnutrition as women couldn't eat normal meals while properly dressed. The aesthetic requirements of formal dress were literally incompatible with normal bodily functions, forcing women between beauty and health. The respiratory problems caused by tight chest bindings and heavy garments led to chronic fatigue and decreased oxygen to the brain, causing memory problems, difficulty concentrating, and mood changes that were attributed to feminine intellectual inferiority rather than oxygen deprivation. The foot problems caused by wearing getter sandals with high wooden platforms led to falls, twisted ankles, and eventually arthritis in women who spent decades walking on what amounted to wooden stilts. The elegant gliding gait required to walk in these shoes was actually a carefully controlled struggle to avoid falling. The eye problems caused by the thick white makeup required special cleaning procedures that often involved harsh chemicals that damaged the delicate eye area. Women developed chronic eye irritation, early cataracts, and vision problems from decades of applying and removing toxic cosmetics around their eyes. The dental decay caused by ohaguro tooth blackening was so severe that many women lost most of their teeth by middle age, requiring them to eat only soft foods and speak carefully to avoid revealing their dental ruin. The beautiful black smile became a toothless mumble hidden behind painted fans. The skin cancer that developed from lead-based cosmetics often appeared as dark patches and lesions that had to be covered with even more toxic makeup. Women developed skin conditions that resembled advanced aging by their 30s, their pursuit of eternal youth accelerating the very decay they sought to prevent. The joint problems caused by formal sitting positions and restrictive clothing led to early arthritis and mobility problems that were dismissed as natural feminine frailty. Women who had spent decades conforming to postural ideals found themselves unable to move normally in old age, prisoners of their own carefully maintained posture. The malnutrition caused by restricted diets led to bone density loss, anemia, and immune system deficiencies that made women vulnerable to every disease that passed through their communities. The delicate, ethereal appearance that was considered ideal was actually a sign of serious nutritional deficiency. The respiratory infections that resulted from sleeping upright to preserve elaborate hairstyles led to chronic cough, chest congestion, and eventually tuberculosis in many women. The commitment to maintaining perfect hair arrangements literally prevented restful sleep and proper breathing. The circulation problems caused by tight garments led to varicose veins, blood clots, and chronic swelling that had to be hidden under layers of clothing. Women developed serious cardiovascular problems from decades of wearing clothing that restricted blood flow to their extremities. The neurological damage from mercury and lead exposure often manifested as tremors, memory loss, and personality changes that were attributed to feminine hysteria or demonic possession. The beautiful faces that concealed toxic poisoning were blamed for causing madness rather than recognized as its source. The infections that developed from unclean cosmetic tools and shared makeup led to skin diseases that spread rapidly through communities of women who all used the same beautifying products and techniques. The pursuit of uniform beauty standards created perfect conditions for the spread of disfiguring skin conditions. The digestive disorders caused by corsetry and tight obi sashes led to chronic stomach problems, ulcers, and malnutrition that made pregnancy dangerous and childbirth often fatal. The aesthetic requirements of feminine beauty were literally incompatible with the biological functions of reproduction. The postural deformities that developed from decades of forced positioning led to spinal curvature, compressed organs, and chronic pain that made normal movement impossible. Women became living sculptures, beautiful but fundamentally damaged by the requirements of their aesthetic perfection. The chemical burns from cosmetic preparations often left permanent scarring that had to be concealed with more toxic makeup, creating cycles of damage and concealment that grew worse over time. The pursuit of flawless skin often resulted in permanently damaged skin that could never be exposed without concealment. The muscle atrophy that resulted from restrictive clothing and limited movement led to weakness, bone loss, and increased vulnerability to falls and injuries. Women became physically fragile, not through natural delicacy, but through the systematic weakening effects of their beauty requirements. The chronic pain that resulted from years of physical restriction, toxic exposure, and postural damage was dismissed as natural feminine suffering that should be endured with grace and silence. Women lived with constant physical discomfort that was considered proof of their refined sensitivity rather than evidence of systematic abuse. The shortened lifespans that resulted from the cumulative effects of toxic cosmetics, restrictive clothing, poor nutrition, and limited exercise were attributed to feminine delicacy rather than the health consequences of beauty standards. Women died young, not from natural frailty, but from the slow poisoning effects of aesthetic ideals. The physical reality of being a samurai wife during this period was a grotesque contradiction. Pursuing beauty through methods that caused ugliness, seeking refinement through practices that caused suffering, and maintaining an appearance of delicate health while slowly destroying actual health. The aesthetic ideal had become a form of culturally sanctioned self-destruction, and women participated in their own gradual physical destruction in the name of feminine perfection. The mental landscape of the declining samurai wife was perhaps even more disturbing than her physical deterioration. Where once these women had possessed agency, creativity, and intellectual engagement, they now inhabited a psychological prison as constrictive as their elaborate clothing. The mind that had once been trained to appreciate subtle beauty and engage in sophisticated cultural discourse was gradually transformed into an instrument of self-surveillance, constantly monitoring for deviations from an increasingly impossible standard of feminine perfection. The phenomenon psychologists would later recognize as learned helplessness became the foundation of the ideal samurai wife's mental state. Every aspect of daily life reinforced the message that independent action was not just inappropriate, but dangerous. The woman who had once managed estates and negotiated political alliances was now taught that even choosing her own clothing or expressing a personal preference about food was evidence of unwomanly assertiveness that could bring shame to her family. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain the facade of contentment while experiencing constant physical discomfort and psychological restriction led to a form of dissociation that became culturally normalized. Women learned to separate their conscious minds from their bodily experiences, treating their own pain and discomfort as distant phenomena that had no connection to their true selves. This mental splitting allowed them to function, but at the cost of authentic self-awareness. The perfectionism that was demanded in every aspect of their lives created a psychological state of chronic anxiety that was disguised as conscientiousness. Every flower arrangement, every brushstroke in calligraphy, every gesture and expression had to conform to precise standards that left no room for individual variation or creative expression. The constant fear of making a mistake that could reflect poorly on their husbands or families created a hyper-vigilant mental state that made relaxation impossible. The emotional labor required to maintain the appearance of serenity while suppressing all natural human emotions created a psychological burden that was invisible but crushing. Women had to perform contentment when they felt despair, gratitude when they felt resentment, and devotion when they felt neglect. This constant emotional performance required enormous mental energy and left little psychological space for authentic self-expression or personal growth. The gaslighting that occurred when women's physical symptoms from toxic cosmetics and restrictive clothing were dismissed as feminine hysteria created profound confusion about their own perceptions and experiences. Women learned to doubt their own sensations, to question their own judgment, and to accept that their subjective experiences were unreliable guides to reality. This systematic undermining of their ability to trust their own perceptions was psychologically devastating. The social isolation that resulted from the increasing restrictions on women's movement and activities created a form of psychological imprisonment that was disguised as protection. Women who had once maintained extensive social networks and engaged in collaborative cultural projects found themselves confined to increasingly narrow social circles, cut off from the intellectual stimulation and emotional support that had once sustained them. The anticipatory grief that became a constant companion as women lived with the knowledge that their husbands might not return from military campaigns created a psychological state of chronic mourning. They had to simultaneously invest emotionally in their relationships while preparing psychologically for sudden loss. This impossible balancing act between attachment and detachment created profound psychological instability. The imposter syndrome that developed as women's genuine accomplishments were increasingly dismissed or attributed to their husband's influence led to profound self-doubt about their own capabilities and worth. Women who had once been confident in their abilities began to question whether their successes had ever been real or whether they had always been merely reflections of masculine achievement. The depression that resulted from the systematic elimination of opportunities for meaningful work and creative expression was disguised as feminine delicacy and spiritual refinement. Women's natural responses to restriction and limitation were reframed as evidence of their superior sensitivity and artistic temperament, making it impossible for them to recognize or address their psychological suffering. The anxiety disorders that developed from constant surveillance and judgment created psychological symptoms that were misinterpreted as evidence of moral failings or spiritual inadequacy. Women's natural stress responses to impossible demands were treated as character flaws that required correction rather than symptoms of an untenable situation. The eating disorders that resulted from aesthetic ideals requiring extreme thinness and pale complexion were understood as evidence of spiritual refinement rather than psychological illness. Women's restriction of their own nourishment was praised as self-control and discipline, making recovery impossible because the symptoms were culturally valued. The obsessive-compulsive behaviors that developed around beauty rituals, household management, and social performance were celebrated as evidence of feminine virtue and attention to detail. The psychological compulsions that made normal functioning impossible were reframed as admirable dedication to excellence. The dissociative symptoms that allowed women to endure physical and psychological abuse were interpreted as evidence of spiritual transcendence and feminine, ethereal nature. The psychological defense mechanisms that protected them from trauma were mystified and romanticized, preventing recognition of the underlying problems. The paranoid thinking that developed from living in an environment where any mistake could lead to disgrace or punishment was dismissed as feminine intuition or appropriate caution. Women's hypervigilance and constant worry were treated as natural feminine characteristics rather than symptoms of psychological trauma. The learned helplessness that resulted from systematic removal of agency and decision-making power was celebrated as appropriate feminine deference and trust in masculine authority. Women's inability to act independently was praised as evidence of their proper understanding of their role and place. The self-harm behaviors that developed as women internalized the message that their own comfort and well-being were unimportant, were ritualized and aestheticized rather than recognized as symptoms of psychological distress. The physical damage women inflicted on themselves in pursuit of beauty ideals was celebrated as self-discipline and dedication. The suicidal ideation that resulted from hopelessness and trapped circumstances was romanticized as poetic sensitivity, an appropriate feminine response to life's suffering. Women's desire to escape their circumstances through death was treated as evidence of spiritual refinement rather than psychological crisis. The identity confusion that resulted from the systematic erasure of individual preferences, opinions, and desires led to profound uncertainty about their own authentic selves. Women lost track of who they were beneath the layers of expectation and performance, becoming psychological ghosts inhabiting elaborately decorated bodies. The trauma bonding that occurred in relationships where love was mixed with control and abuse created psychological attachments that were impossible to break even when escape opportunities arose. Women became psychologically dependent on the very relationships that were destroying them, unable to imagine existence outside the familiar patterns of control and restriction. The cognitive decline that resulted from chronic stress, poor nutrition, and toxic exposure was attributed to natural feminine intellectual limitations rather than the effects of their circumstances. Women's decreased mental functioning was used as evidence that they were naturally inferior, rather than recognition that their environment was systematically damaging their cognitive abilities. The emotional numbing that developed as a protective response to chronic stress and trauma was celebrated as appropriate feminine emotional control and spiritual discipline. The psychological defense that protected women from feeling the full impact of their suffering also prevented them from accessing the emotional energy needed for resistance or change. The memory problems that resulted from chronic stress and dissociation were dismissed as feminine scatterbrained nature rather than symptoms of psychological trauma. Women's inability to remember clearly was used as evidence of their unreliability rather than recognition of the effects of chronic stress on cognitive function. The hypervigilance that developed from living in constant danger of criticism or punishment created a psychological state of exhaustion that was disguised as feminine delicacy and need for protection. Women's chronic fatigue from psychological stress was treated as evidence of their natural fragility rather than the effects of living under constant threat. The people-pleasing behaviors that developed as survival strategies in environments where disapproval could be dangerous were celebrated as feminine virtue and appropriate concern for others' feelings. The psychological compulsion to prioritize others' needs over their own was treated as moral excellence rather than trauma response. The perfectionism that developed as a defense against criticism and punishment created psychological prison where nothing was ever good enough. Women's obsessive attention to detail and fear of making mistakes was praised as conscientiousness rather than recognized as anxiety response to impossible standards. The self-blame that resulted from gaslighting and systematic undermining of their perceptions led women to take responsibility for problems and abuse that were not their fault. The psychological tendency to assume they were somehow causing their own suffering prevented them from recognizing the external sources of their problems. The fantasy life that became increasingly elaborate as reality became more constrained provided psychological escape, but also prevented engagement with actual problems. Women's retreat into imagination and fantasy was sometimes the only mental space available to them. but it also kept them from developing practical strategies for improvement. The codependency that developed in relationships where women's value was determined entirely by their ability to support and enhance masculine achievement created psychological patterns that persisted even when circumstances changed. Women learned to define themselves entirely in relation to others, losing the ability to recognize or pursue their own independent goals and interests. The psychological fragmentation that resulted from the impossibility of integrating their multiple roles and expectations created internal conflicts that were irreconcilable. Women had to be simultaneously strong and weak, intelligent and deferential, capable and helpless, creating psychological splits that made coherent identity formation impossible. The ultimate tragedy was that these psychological patterns, once established, became self-perpetuating. Women who had been systematically broken, psychologically, often became the most effective enforcers of the same restrictions on the next generation, unable to recognize the systems that had damaged them, and unconsciously perpetuating the cycle of psychological imprisonment that had destroyed their own possibilities for authentic existence. The death of the samurai wife as a cultural institution wasn't marked by dramatic collapse or sudden catastrophe, but rather by a slow suffocation that mirrored the individual deaths of countless women who simply stopped existing as autonomous beings long before their bodies ceased functioning. By the time the Tokugawa shogunate consolidated power in the early 17th century, the transformation was complete. The influential, educated, culturally sophisticated women who had once shaped Japanese society had been replaced by living dolls, whose primary function was decorative compliance. The final nail in the coffin came with the formal codification of the Confucian family system under Tokugawa rule. The legal framework that emerged didn't just restrict women's rights, it effectively erased them as independent legal entities. A samurai wife became legally indistinguishable from a piece of valuable property, something to be protected, displayed, and transferred between male guardians, but never something that could own, decide, or act independently. The educational restrictions that were formalized during this period completed the intellectual murder that had been underway for centuries. The literacy that had once been women's pathway to cultural influence was systematically curtailed, with female education limited to basic household management and aesthetic accomplishments that had no practical application beyond entertainment. The minds that had once produced great literature and innovative cultural forms were deliberately stunted and misdirected. The physical confinement that characterized the fully developed samurai wife ideal reached levels that would have been impossible during the earlier periods, when women still retained some practical authority. The inner quarters of samurai residences became elaborate prisons, beautiful and comfortable perhaps, but prisons nonetheless, where women could live their entire adult lives without ever venturing beyond the garden walls. The economic dependency that had been gradually increasing over centuries reached its logical conclusion when women were completely excluded from any form of productive work or financial control. They became entirely dependent on male relatives for every aspect of survival, unable to support themselves even if they somehow managed to escape their domestic confines. The cultural amnesia that set in during this period was perhaps the most devastating aspect of the decline. The achievements of earlier generations of samurai wives were systematically forgotten, their contributions erased from historical records, their innovations attributed to male relatives or simply ignored. The very possibility that women could be culturally significant became unthinkable. The aesthetic that emerged from this final phase was one of exquisite fragility, where the ideal woman was so delicate, so refined, so ethereal that she seemed barely capable of existing in the physical world. This wasn't beauty in any meaningful sense. It was the aestheticization of helplessness, the transformation of victimization into an art form. The psychological profile of the ideal samurai wife at this stage was essentially that of a beautifully maintained corpse, perfectly preserved, elaborately decorated, completely motionless. The personality traits that were celebrated, submission, silence, self-sacrifice, were essentially the characteristics of someone who had given up any claim to independent existence. The daily routine of these women became a form of elaborate performance art centered around the theme of non-existence. Every moment was scripted, every gesture predetermined, every thought channeled through prescribed forms. They became living demonstrations of the proposition that human beings could be transformed into decorative objects without actually dying. The marriage ceremonies of this period were particularly revealing in their symbolism. The bride was literally carried to her new home, often unconscious from the weight of her clothing and makeup, physically incapable of participating in her own transition from one form of male guardianship to another. The rituals celebrated not the beginning of a partnership, but the successful transfer of a valuable possession. The medical treatment that women received during this period reflected their status as decorative objects rather than human beings. Their illnesses were treated primarily in terms of how they affected their appearance, rather than their health or comfort. A woman might receive elaborate treatment for a skin blemish that affected her beauty, while serious internal conditions that didn't show externally were ignored. The literary production of this period shows women's voices becoming progressively fainter and more conventional until they virtually disappear altogether. The bold, innovative writing that had characterized earlier eras gave way to formulaic poetry that expressed only approved sentiments in approved forms. Creativity had been successfully murdered through the elimination of any context in which it could flourish. The architectural evolution of samurai residences during this period created spaces that were specifically designed to prevent women from engaging in any meaningful activity. The rooms dedicated to feminine pursuits were beautiful, but functionally useless, designed for the performance of aesthetic activities that had no productive purpose beyond the demonstration of leisure and refinement. The social gatherings that women attended became increasingly theatrical and meaningless. Elaborate performances of feminine accomplishment that demonstrated skill in activities that had no application beyond entertainment. The tea ceremonies, flower arrangements, and musical performances became hollow rituals divorced from any authentic cultural significance. The correspondence between women during this period reveals the intellectual and emotional starvation that characterized their lives. Letters that had once been vehicles for political discussion, cultural innovation, and personal expression became formulaic exchanges of seasonal observations and conventional sentiments, empty performances of literacy that demonstrated the writer's education while revealing nothing of her actual thoughts or feelings. The child-rearing practices that evolved during this period focused primarily on preparing the next generation for the same restricted existence. Daughters were trained from infancy to suppress any signs of independence, creativity, or authentic self-expression, while sons were taught to view women as decorative accessories rather than autonomous beings. The religious practices available to women became increasingly focused on resignation, acceptance, and the cultivation of qualities that supported their restricted status. Spiritual development was redefined to mean the elimination of any desires or ambitions that might conflict with total submission to male authority. The economic arrangements that surrounded women's lives became increasingly complex systems for managing valuable property rather than supporting human beings. Dowries, inheritance laws, and marriage settlements treated women as assets to be protected and transferred rather than individuals with their own economic interests or capabilities. The legal system that emerged treated women's voices as essentially inadmissible evidence. In disputes, their testimony was automatically considered less reliable than that of any male witness. Regardless of their knowledge or proximity to the events in question, they became legal non-entities, present but not recognized as legitimate participants in the systems that governed their lives. The medical understanding of women's bodies during this period was distorted by aesthetic considerations to the point where normal biological functions were pathologized if they interfered with the appearance of ethereal fragility. pregnancy, menstruation, and aging were treated as diseases that required concealment and management rather than natural processes that might affect women's lives and choices. The educational content available to women focused almost exclusively on the cultivation of traits that supported their decorative function. Skills like reading, writing, and arithmetic were taught only to the extent necessary for household management, while broader intellectual development was actively discouraged as inappropriate and potentially dangerous. The communication patterns that developed within families reflected women's reduced status as psychological entities. They were expected to understand and respond to indirect communication while being discouraged from expressing their own thoughts or needs directly. The result was a form of emotional isolation that persisted even within intimate relationships. The aging process for women in this system was particularly cruel, as their value was entirely tied to their appearance and fertility. As these declined, women became increasingly invisible and irrelevant, often spending their final decades as forgotten presences in households where their decades of service and sacrifice were taken for granted. The death rituals surrounding women reflected their status as property rather than persons. Their funerals focused on their roles as wives and mothers rather than their individual accomplishments or characteristics. They were mourned not for who they had been, but for the functions they had performed and would no longer be able to fulfill. The historical record-keeping of this period systematically excluded women's perspectives and experiences, creating an official history in which half the population simply didn't exist as meaningful actors. The voices that had once contributed to cultural and political discourse were silenced so completely that their absence wasn't even noticed. The final irony was that this system, which claimed to honor and protect women, actually represented the most complete destruction of feminine potential ever achieved by a civilized society. Under the guise of reverence and care, an entire gender had been transformed from active participants in civilization to passive objects of aesthetic appreciation, their humanity sacrificed on the altar of an ideal that celebrated their elimination as autonomous beings. And so we reach the end of our journey into the paper-walled world of the samurai wife, a story that began with promise and power, but concluded with one of the history's most elegant forms of cultural murder. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps there's something oddly comforting about the predictability of this particular tragedy, the way societies can transform protection into imprisonment, reverence into erasure, beauty into a form of slow suicide. The samurai wife's story is ultimately about the gap between ideals and reality, about how the pursuit of perfection can become the perfect method of destruction. These women were told they were being honored, protected, and elevated, while simultaneously being systematically stripped of every quality that makes human existence meaningful. It's a masterclass in how oppression can be packaged as privilege, how elimination can be disguised as refinement. What makes this story particularly haunting is how thoroughly the victims participated in their own destruction, how completely they internalized the values that were slowly killing them. By the end, they weren't just complying with restrictions imposed from outside. They were actively policing themselves and each other, ensuring that the beautiful prison they inhabited remained escape-proof. The aesthetic achievements of this culture were genuine and lasting, but they came at a cost that's difficult to calculate. How many innovations were never made? How many problems never solved? How many beautiful and necessary things never created? Because half the population was transformed into decorative objects. The gardens were lovely, the poetry was exquisite, and the overall effect was one of refined elegance built on the systematic waste of human potential. There's something almost mathematically perfect about how this decline unfolded. Each generation accepting slightly more restriction, slightly less agency, slightly greater reduction in what constituted an acceptable existence for women. No single step seemed dramatic enough to resist, but the cumulative effect was the difference between being a person and being a beautifully maintained corpse. The persistence of these patterns long after the samurai class itself disappeared suggests something uncomfortable about how easily societies can convince people to accept their own diminishment if the process is gradual enough and aesthetically pleasing enough. The techniques perfected in the world of the samurai wife have been exported and adapted by cultures around the world, proving their effectiveness at transforming human beings into decorative objects. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this story is how normal it all seemed to the people living through it. The women who suffered under this system often genuinely believed they were living privileged lives, that their restrictions were protections, that their limitations were evidence of their special status. The psychological techniques that made this possible are still in use today, still transforming people into willing participants in their own restriction. Yet there's also something reassuring about the ultimate failure of this system to completely erase the humanity it sought to control. Even at the height of restriction, even when women had been reduced to decorative objects, something essentially human persisted, in private letters, in moments of rebellion, in the simple fact that many of them survived with their sanity intact. The human spirit proved surprisingly resilient, even under conditions designed to eliminate it entirely. The samurai wife story reminds us that cultural achievements and moral progress are not the same thing, that a society can produce great art while simultaneously committing slow-motion atrocities against its own members. Beauty and horror can coexist so seamlessly that people mistake one for the other, finding aesthetic pleasure in systems that are fundamentally destructive. As you settle into sleep, perhaps you can find some peace in the knowledge that this particular form of elaborate cultural murder is now recognized for what it was, that the beautiful restrictions that once seemed so natural and appropriate are now visible as the prison they always were. The samurai wife's long nightmare is over, but her story remains. A reminder that the most dangerous oppression often comes disguised as protection, that the most effective prisons are often the ones we're taught to call home, and that sometimes the most radical act is simply insisting on remaining human in a world that prefers you decorative and still.